what I'm going to talk to you about today is really a humble effort to show the consistencies between various systems. I think, you know, we all talk of CAA, we talk of Canberra Accord, and there's actually a number of systems out there which I think are fantastic systems. And once you start investigating them and looking at them more closely, you discover that they are very close to the systems that we are actually using. And I thought it's a worthwhile exercise to show you exactly how they interlink. I want to do that through showing or concentrating, focusing a short while on the CAA validation system and all the different aspects of that. Then still move on to CAA within the Canberra Accord, and then tell you a little bit about the Canberra Accord. George will correct me when I stray. Then I want to share some of my experiences. I was going to talk about Australia, but their system is actually, they're busy with a major overhaul, and I think perhaps we should just not talk about that today, but rather focus on the American accreditation system. NAB stands for the National Architectural Accreditation Board, because theirs is a fascinating system. They have all the money, they have everything, and you'll see it is actually quite an amazing system. And I also want us to look at future challenges, because I do believe that most of the challenges that we are faced with here, or in Namibia, or wherever, are really shared. I mean, they are the same. And there is such a lot that we can learn from one another if we just are willing to listen to what other people do and communicate and consult. I really shouldn't tell you what international benchmarking is about, but you know, in a way, it feels to me that benchmarking in terms of education is no different to what I do as an architect out in practice. If I want to grow as a designer, what do? I have to look at everything out there. I have to look at the best work out there. I study the works of masters, and I assimilate and I gather information. I reinterpret them, and in the end, I apply them within my own context in a totally different manner. That's what international benchmarking is about, to my mind at least. We have to look at international benchmarking because of the increasing globalization of the profession, the increasingly interrelated international context that we're working within, and obviously facilitating the portability of architectural education credentials. When I was in America earlier this year, they registered the first architect with a non-NAB or NCAP degree as an architect in the UK through Canberra, which I think is pretty amazing. In the US, yeah. And then also, as I've explained, it really is about taking globally relevant skills and understandings and applied within your own context. Moving on, sorry about that. The CAA has got a very interesting history, and I think the CAA is quite unique. As we go through the system, you'll understand why. I'll talk about Sir Robert Matthew in a short while. So what is the CAA? CAA is an international association of national architecture organizations, all with equal standing, regardless of size. And this very crucial CAA partnership ethos underpins the entire validation system, and it draws on people and expertise across the entire membership. It is currently the only international validation system operating within an established partnership mode between various member countries. And I think George has spoken about that briefly, but The validation board of the CAA, typically to a school, would include out-of-country experts, both in region and out of region, alongside the local academic and practitioner experts. When we look at the fundamentals of the CAA validation system, it really is about validating of competencies and variety, just like Gerald referred to just a while ago. I think this is what makes the CAA quite different. And you'll see when we look at Canberra and NARP that it's basically the same. So what is it about? It's about the validation of appropriate international standards by means of assessment through peer review, and the maintenance and encouragement of diversity, variety, and development. So it is never about standardization, never. Sir Robert Matthew, the founder-president of CAA, said, "We cannot repeat this too often. All countries must base their education on their own circumstances. No country, however, is an island. And students, especially today, demand facilities for moving from one country to another." And look, that was written in 1969, and it's true even today, even more today. I'm going to touch on important aspects within the history and development of the CAA. So way back in 1966, the Commonwealth Board of Architectural Education was formed. RIBA standards were adopted for the present. And this board was meant to work out its own machinery for recognition with a system of visiting panels. In 1968, the first CAA list of schools published was put forward by national institutes following consultations with the appropriate national bodies. In 1971, standards and objectives approved the CAA's own standard for recognition established based on 10 criteria. And like with SACAP, we've gone through a whole series of different colored books. It's actually quite interesting to see the first one, the Blue Book, which was published in 1990, consisted of 4 pages. Wonderful days. And it had generalized standards and objectives. And as I said, the schools nominated by member institutes published in this. The Green Book followed in 1992, 8 pages. And this contained the objectives and procedures for visiting boards and documentation. This was in turn followed by the Red Book in 2000, Qualifications in Architecture recommended for recognition by CAA, 47 pages. And for the first time, a comprehensive policy, procedures, and criteria. In 2008, the Green Book was published. You all have copies of the Green Book. It's still in use and currently under review. Important additions and changes to the Green Book were the procedure for acceptance and quality assurance of national and regional validation systems. It had to deal with master's courses, which at the time started at various learning institutions. And it also had to deal with courses delivered in other than normal settings. It also included a reporting format, and it included an appeals procedure. Some of the more important developments: 2008 April, CAA signs Canberra Accord. 2008 July, it resumes administration at the end of the RIBA contract. 2009, secretaries to attend all boards. January 2012, new nominations expand validation to panel to 48. And then importantly for us, I think this year too, in March or last year, visits outside the Commonwealth approved by CAA Council, subject to procedure and full cost recovery. That was quite a new route for CAA. And the introduction of quarterly management meetings. So the membership profile currently, 42 representatives from, I can't remember, about 12 countries, 14 countries, and 9 on the reserve list. South Africa has 7 representatives. This is the makeup of the Validation Panel Executive Committee, currently chaired by Claire Newton of Australia. Our secretary is Jim Lowe, the UK. Many of you have met Jim. Members, Essie Beniasar, Hong Kong, myself, Kevin Singh, the UK, Mansour Kofi, Nigeria, and then George, who's our advisor. In terms of recognition processes, there are different approaches. The first one being direct validation. So this is by a CAA visiting board. And all of these qualifications are accepted by the Canberra Court. Then there are direct validations under the partnership agreement. So it's partnering national systems not recognized by CAA. And all of these qualifications are still accepted by the Canberra Court. And then system validation. Qualifications valid in this way are not accepted by the Canberra Court. Currently, we have 2 systems. There's still the Australian system, but I think there's a move away from systems to a partnering system. So schools either have direct validation, and there are 19 schools in 9 countries, including Ghana, India, Hong Kong, Jamaica, Kenya, Nigeria, Sri Lanka, South Africa, and Uganda. All of these qualifications are accepted by the Canberra Court. And just a footnote referring to the South African system, which ceased recognition in May 2010, and that was replaced by the direct validation, which means that schools now validated are also, their qualifications are accepted by the Canberra Court. System validation, there are 65 schools in 2 systems. It's Australia, New Zealand, and the UK. As I said, these qualifications are not accepted by the Canberra Court. And what's happened in the meanwhile is that Australia and New Zealand formed the ANZ system in 2012, and the New Zealand schools transferred to the system. I think there are now 21 schools under the one system, or possibly with Papua New Guinea. Some highlights in the activity in the past 3 years. 15 direct validation visiting boards, 10 to Africa, 1 in the Americas, 2 to Oceania, and 2 to Asia. 3 system validation sample visits, 2 in Africa, 1 in Oceania, and 2 system agreements. July 2012, the CAA SACAP agreement. This is now under the idea of a system partnering. And in this year, in June, the CAA Hong Kong Institute of Architects and the Architectural Registration Board, I think, the system partnering system there as well. Future activities. Visits, 3 direct initial validation visits, 6 direct revalidation visits, and 1 system revalidation visit in Australia. Agreements, 1 system agreement, CAA with the Australian, New Zealand, Papua New Guinea grouping, and 1 partner agreement. That's a prospective one. Others, the CAA system review by the Canberra Court. I will show you just now that CAA is the next to be reviewed by the Canberra Court, the various partners. And as part of that process, we are busy with a complete review of the Green Book. We have started with this process. It will conclude towards the end of August in next year. And it happens through 1, consultation with stakeholders, workshops with Skype, and thirdly, draw from current practice. all the recently reviewed accreditation procedures that CA members have gone through. That's the Australian, New Zealand, RIBA, SACAP, and of course, the Canberra Accord. So what do we need to consider? It is important to always review and enhance the procedures, to revise procedures where necessary. We need to look at a system validation or relook the system validation system, Appendix B, Appendix E, direct validation, which now has more of a partnership focus. And it's necessary to develop new procedures, specifically in terms of validating Commonwealth non-member countries and other countries outside of the Commonwealth, and then supporting the development of national validation systems, which we've done all along. There's a need to review all of the criteria applied and develop guidelines and checklists, and of course also to align our terminology with international practice. If you ever read through any Canberra Accord documentation, you see that everything is / because everyone uses a different term for the same. So what are the challenges? I think the biggest challenge for CAA, in the way that it operates internationally, is consistency in the application of criteria and standards. It is a big challenge, and it's a challenge that is very difficult to overcome. Much of that lies with the training of panelists. Again, it's difficult for CAA because we operate in so many different countries to oversee all of the training, and it's, of course, a costly exercise. Resourcing, finding money, we all know the problems. And then finding space for exchange and improvement of knowledge and skills in education, adding value to the system for the CAA College of Schools, and delivering portability and recognition of the CAA list by national authorities. Now, I'm briefly going to take you through the Canberra Accord. You'll see a lot of similarities already as I go through this. The Canberra Accord was signed to facilitate international mobility of graduates in architecture and to contribute to improving the quality of architectural education through benchmarking between the founder signatory authorities. Central to this all is the idea that there should be a balance between benchmarking appropriate international standards and encouraging a variety of approach. It's exactly what the CAA does. And of course, it embraces the relevant standards and principles recommended by the UNESCO UI Charter. The signatory countries were Australia, Canada, Korea, US, China, CAA, and Mexico. And what happened, they all had established systems, and they agreed to be substantially equivalent after a comparative review of the systems, followed by a periodic review visit. This started, the accord was effective from Jan 2010. All of the signatories were committed to further develop the multilateral accord into a worldwide accord, and I think that that's happening with strides. And as far as the CAA is concerned, I just want to repeat, it only applies to directly validated courses of the CAA. And it added value to CAA validation. NAB, for example, now offer 155 credits towards meeting the NCARB education standard. So this is an added advantage for anyone, all our members, all the CAA members. CAA participation, there's obviously a subscription. Everyone has to survive financially. It depends on the number of validated schools within the system, so it varies. There's the commitment to promote the accord, and that's why we're talking about it here today. Yes, CNA has representation at annual meetings. Some of the data of the CAA is shown on the website, and CAA gets to nominate system reviewers. I'm a Canberra Court reviewer for nominated by CAA, for example. I just thought we should perhaps just look at periodic review of signatory systems, because it's quite interesting. It is the same process that any other system would go through under even the old systems agreement that we had, say, with SACAP. So it's a slightly different visit. It's an extended visit that not only concerns observing how a school is accredited, but it also observes how the accrediting body utilizes and apply their own rules and regulations and procedures. So under Canberra Court, this happens at intervals of not more than 6 years. There's a predetermined schedule and a set of procedures. As I said, the review process is comprised of two components. Firstly, observing any accreditation visit to any educational institution, and then observing the normal processes and procedures of the signatory system. And the documentation, like any normal review process, there's a self-evaluation by the signatory system, and they have to provide a comprehensive set of criteria, policies, and procedures that they apply. And obviously that's followed by a review report. Now, under the review schedule, I just want to show you that these are the inspections that have taken place. The last one was now the US, which I was part of. Next year it'll be CAA, and the year after Australia. And now I want to dwell on now, because I think many of the things that you, Gerald, mentioned as part of your system and the problems of the systems, I think are dealt with in very interesting ways by the American system. And I think we can learn a lot from them. Just imagine they have 151 accredited programs that they're responsible for in 50 states, 3 territories, and the District of Columbia. If you think that their cycle is currently 6 years, it means that you're doing 35 validation inspections per year. It's incredible. I mean, we can't even think of it. Again here, the central elements of accreditation criteria and procedures are self-assessment and student performance. It's exactly as our system. The accreditation model, there are 2 abiding values and principles that I find interesting. It's the creation of constant conditions for diverse contexts and the continuous improvement through regular review. Their accreditation model is interesting because it is not a top-down process, and I think this makes it different. They acknowledge that the training or education of an architect is the joint responsibility of the academy and the profession. And as such, they involve all of the partners that deals with architectural education. It makes for a different type of process. So it is not only representative, but it's broad, it's inclusive. The 4, what they call collaterals that contribute to this process would be the American Institute of Architects. And they would all have equal representation in everything. The American Institute of Architectural Students, and then the ACSA, the Association of Collegiate Schools of Architecture, and NCARB, the National Council of Architectural Registration Board. These are the 4 main role players, and they control the entire accreditation process. So there is this idea of shared ownership. They feel they are the co-authors of this accreditation document, and they feel that they have control over the development of that document, which I think is very important, because it is based on the idea that it is an iterative process that acknowledges the values and the contributions of all educators, all professionals in traditional and non-traditional practice, as well as students. To my mind, the most abiding features of the American model is that of uniformity and consistency. And it is the way that they structure their system that makes it uniform and consistent. And you can imagine if you have 151 programs, you better need to be consistent. So how do they do that? Documentation is a big part of that. What they've done is they've separated their documents in two different main volumes. The first one deals with procedures. Procedures, I think, if you look at theirs, I think it's dated back to 2012, the last one. But there's a continual review, and there are not that many changes. And it is something that needs to be amended, small things. So they amend it on an annual basis and then republish. Whereas, and they have a standing committee, that's all they do. They review this process. And then they have a separate document which deals with the conditions of accreditation. And this is where it becomes very impressive. Every 5 years, they have an accreditation review conference. And this conference is attended by all of the role players, representatives of all of the role players. They also invite representatives from other related institutes, but also members of public, etc. And it's a week-long affair. And then they argue and they debate any changes that they see happening to the procedures. At the end of that process, all of the changes are collated into a document, and then it goes through a 3-year review period before it's actually implemented, finally, and published. I just think that that's incredible, because it shows you again that all of the role players have equal representation, and they are all in control of the process and the procedures and the conditions. They also manage their consistency through the way that they implement their system. It's a very well-structured system, as I've said. You can imagine 35 visits per year. So what they do is they say visits only take place during a couple of months each year. You can't ask when you want the visit. I think they have 4 months in which they do all of the visits. Their council only meets 3 times a year. And then what is completely different to our system, the system that we used to, is that the visiting team, when they leave the institution, are only allowed to convey certain things, definitely not the findings, but they will be allowed to say, you know, they will highlight positives. You always start with the positives. They will highlight causes of concern, and then they've got a SPC, it's student performance criteria, it's part of their criteria. They have I think 34 of these criteria, and they're only allowed to say SPCs not met. They then do a recommendation only, and that recommendation goes back to the board, and only the board decides on make the final decision. It sounds different, it sounds funny, but I think what they managed to do is that that process sort of enables them to get rid of inconsistencies within the report. And they, as I will show you just now, all the board members are trained. So they sit with 30-odd accreditation reports. And they spend 2 days and they go through all of these reports, and then they summarize their findings. And they then make the final decision, which I think is quite interesting. Their system is a rigorous system, and you have to adhere to it. 2 years after the visit, you have to send your first interim report dealing with all of the issues that were highlighted as concerns. And every year after that, by a certain date somewhere in September, you have to submit the next architectural program report. So there's an annual report, it's an online exercise, and these reports then get scrutinized by NAB staff, and if they find any inconsistencies, it is referred to the board of directors, and so they're able to red flag problems in a school. I don't think it's an ideal system, but it certainly is interesting. That's part of the way that they monitor the entire system. They're now looking at, believe it or not, they've in principle approved an 8-year cycle between visits, provided that the school have had 2 reports with no concerns in the past. So then the period will expand to 8 years. It's obviously an issue of money. You know, the accreditation process is very expensive, and what they are trying to do is to utilize the existing system, but also embrace cloud-based technology, etc., as a way of monitoring this. And it will be interesting in the end to see what they come up with as all the measures to monitor this very long period. Perhaps the most impressive part of their system is that of training. Like us, they go through a formal nomination period, process, but each of the 4 organizations would nominate their own to a central validation panel board. And then they go through intensive training. There's a formal online training course that you have to do, and then you have to do face-to-face training. And this applies to all panel members, to panel chairs. The panel chair gets different training. And in fact, the role of the chair in America is quite different. Once, you know, the visiting team members would be sorted out like 4 months before the visit. And once the chair is actually selected, the chair takes over the liaison function between NAB and the school, which I think is quite interesting. So there would be a pre-visit by the chair to quickly look and see whether the facilities that they want to have, the exhibition, etc., comply. So it's like a pre-visit. And I think it makes it a lot easier for program administrators. And it takes a lot of pressure off the schools. But they also train the program administrators at the various schools. So they get all the program administrators in and say, this is what accreditation is about. This is the process. And then I've alluded to this earlier, that they also train the NAB directors. And every year, all of these people would be put on a refresher course to just update them on the latest happenings and developments and changes. That, I think, is quite impressive. What was very impressive is that the school that we went to as part of the observation process was a Baptist School of Architecture. And it was actually quite amazing to see this young team operate. a senior member of the team was involved in an accident on their way there, and they had to do with 4 people on the team, none of whom had ever done any validation inspections. And through this chair, they negotiated their way through this thing so beautifully and so competently. I was astonished. And I think that's the fruits of proper training. I think if we look, it's clear to us all that the landscape that within which the professional education in architecture and accreditation must function today is markedly different to that with which we were familiar with 20 years ago. And if any accrediting body wants to remain relevant and of any value over the next 2 or 5 decades, they will need to keep up with all of the challenges and all of the new developments. And this is where it becomes extremely useful to latch onto a different system, because they have already experienced the problems that we're now faced with. The first one is growing diversity of academic pathways. So this is online and distance learning delivery models, the so-called MOOCs, massive open online courses. So this issue of stereoculture, our old traditional and treasured stereoculture versus the virtual studio. The Americans call it bricks and clicks debate. So what is the role and purpose of online distance MOOCs compared to that of the physical campus and face-to-face interface learning as we used to it? And NAB is discussing this in a very constructive way, and they've already identified ways and means of accommodating them within their own system, which I think is the right way to go. There's the increasing mobility of students internationally. So there's definitely a need for parity and standardization of credit transfer by different institutions. It's an ongoing problem. I'm sure you're dealing with it here in South Africa. When students come from elsewhere, it's the same thing in America, and NAB offers a specific service to such students. But in America, there's also a big problem between the various states in terms of parity of credit transfer. Yes, I mean, the balancing of traditional 2D visualization skills with modern 3D, what do they call the modern stuff? 5D visualization skills. So like, BIM, the building information modeling. So all of these things are out there, and there are other institutions that have gone through all the motions and could possibly help us in dealing with our own. The one issue that's always come up, and one that bothers me a lot, is that of comprehensive design. Now, if you look at the American system, it's a tick box system. I mean, the student performance criteria you get on a sheet, and it states that the criteria at the top, and then you go through the subjects, and you just make a mark, and it's not met, not met. In the end, yet, if you look at the end result of the work of the students, then you understand that you cannot look at comprehensive design in this way. It is not ticking boxes. So, in a way, I think we still need to define comprehensive design properly. And even within the American system, they're grappling with this. So what are the expectations for student achievement in comprehensive design? Because at the end of that 5 years, that is really what you're testing. How do you test it? And then I just put this in because I think all accrediting bodies will have to consider whether it is their duty to be involved in the wider mission of things. Are you only involved with accreditation? Or do you want to have a say in future aspirations of the profession? Research, for example, is another issue. So, is it possible that the accreditation bodies could also start looking and guiding research? It's just a question. So, in conclusion, I hope what I've shown you today have highlighted the fact that there are more similarities between the various systems than differences. And whether we are latched onto you as SACAP, are latched onto CAA or Canberra, or whether it falls under NAB. The Americans do accreditation, direct accreditation in Africa nowadays, but then they impose their own system. Essentially, it is still the same system. It is about competencies and variety. I think those are the commonalities between CAA, the Canberra Accord, and a very comprehensive system such as NAB. All of these bodies still have to go through benchmarking against international best practice. It is the only way of ensuring that you are still on par and that you are still making a valuable contribution. The shared problems and challenges, we all share the problems. You know, this whole thing of consistency, I think, is a big problem within the South African system and also within CAA. Consistency is difficult because you sometimes get someone that would, a strong personality that would take over the validation visit, and they, in a way, force it into a certain direction. So how do you do away with that? It's interesting, the Americans, even afterwards, they would do an assessment of all the people that served on the panel and the chair. And that gets recorded somewhere. So it's just interesting that I think here, in terms of, say, monitoring, I think CAA and possibly Australia and South Africa, we're the only agencies where, as part of the monitoring process, we use external examiners. It's not used in America at all. I still believe it is a very good way of red flagging problems within a school. So it's interesting that under the American system, external examiners don't feature anywhere. I think it's important as part of the documentation template that we always provide. But I also think it is perhaps important in terms of a way of monitoring. Now, Gerald, you might know that the Australians have a slightly different system. So within this, I think they have a 5-year cycle between visits. They have annual visits done by a smaller visiting panel, the same people that initially went, but it will be limited to 2 people. And they will then revisit and check that, you know, what progress has been made, and an annual report will be written. But obviously that's very, very expensive. And now that they're expanding and they also include Papua New Guinea and New Zealand, I think it becomes even more expensive. So it'll be interesting to see what they develop in terms of a monitoring system. That concludes my talk. I just wanted to end by saying that now I'm wearing the Namibian hat. I think there's a lot to be learned for SACAP in terms of something or a system, accreditation system, which is developed not from the top down, but from the bottom up. And I think the new role of SACAP within, possibly potential new role within Southern Africa, will be fraught with difficulties, where I think institutions or systems like the CAA system would be of great help, because I think CAA is the only system where they work in so many different countries. But if I wear my Namibian hat, you refer to a standard reaction when people say Commonwealth Association, and you say colonial. Now, in Namibia, if you say SACAP, they say colonial. It's the same problem. It's the same problem. There is a huge need for us to join forces. South Africa's got too few schools to form a proper system on its own. I think it would be wonderful to include Botswana, Namibia, Mozambique, Zambia, Zimbabwe into a regional grouping. And perhaps, CAA can be instrumental in getting to a system which in the end would be a regional system with all of these countries included. Thanks.